March 1941, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, California. The scaffolding groaned under the weight of 16 men. Ted Nelson looked up from his welding torch just in time to see it happen. The wooden support beam buckled, metal poles twisted, and 3 workers plummeted 15 feet into the submarine's interior compartment below. The screaming started immediately. Nelson dropped his torch and ran. By the time he reached the collapsed structure, other workers were already pulling the injured men out. One had a shattered collarbone. Another couldn't put weight on his ankle. The third was bleeding from a gash across his forehead. This was the 4th scaffolding incident in 2 months. And Ted Nelson, an $11 a day welder, knew exactly why it kept happening. The US Navy was doing everything wrong, and he was about to prove it. What none of his bosses knew was this: the solution already existed, sketched in a worn notebook sitting in Nelson's toolbox. A design so simple it seemed obvious. A method so revolutionary it would cut production time by 95% and save America 50 million man-hours in the war to come. Mare Island Naval Shipyard stretched across 635 acres of California waterfront in the spring of 1941. 12,000 workers operated in 3 shifts, 7 days a week, around the clock. The machines never stopped. The welding torches never cooled. Because everyone at Mare Island understood what the newspapers weren't quite saying yet. The war was coming. Pearl Harbor was exactly 9 months away. And America's Pacific Fleet wasn't ready. The yard was behind schedule on every submarine in production. Not because the workers were slow, not because the materials were scarce, but because of one massive, infuriating bottleneck that ground everything to a halt: a wooden deck installation. Every submarine needed wooden decking. Wood provided traction on wet surfaces. Wood stayed quieter when sailors moved across it. Wood insulated against the freezing cold of steel hulls. The Navy had used wooden decks for generations, and they weren't about to change now. But the installation method was a nightmare. Picture this. You need to attach wooden planks to a steel submarine frame, but you can't just nail them down. Naval specifications require threaded bolts. So workers drill holes through the wood. They position the planks on the steel frame. Then comes the insanity. Below the deck, inside the cramped submarine compartments, spaces barely 4 feet high, workers construct massive scaffolding structures. Multiple levels of platforms, dozens of support beams, all so men can stand underneath the deck with wrenches in hand, waiting. Above deck, other workers drop long threaded bolts down through the wooden planks and through matching holes in the steel frame. Below deck, the scaffolding workers grab these bolts, thread nuts onto them, and tighten everything by hand, 1 bolt at a time, 1 nut at a time, 12 to 16 men, 5 to 7 days, just to install the deck on a single submarine. Ted Nelson had spent hundreds of hours on those scaffolding platforms. He knew every miserable detail, the way your back screamed after 6 hours bent over in a 4-foot compartment, the way wrenches slipped and shredded your knuckles against steel bulkheads, the way the man above you would drop a bolt and you'd have to feel around in the dark to find it because there wasn't enough room to look up. It was like building furniture in your attic while someone in your basement tried to hold the screws in place. Except the attic was a steel tube, and the basement was even smaller, and both of you were racing against a clock that ticked toward war. Nelson had calculated the numbers in his notebook. For 1 submarine deck, approximately 140 hours of total labor. For 1 destroyer deck, 380 hours. For 1 aircraft carrier flight deck, over 2,000 hours. And Mare Island alone was building dozens of vessels simultaneously. The waste was staggering. The delays were unconscionable. The injuries from collapsing scaffolding were inevitable. But what made Ted Nelson's blood boil wasn't just the inefficiency, It was that he'd already solved the problem. 3 months earlier, he'd sketched the answer in his notebook: a handheld welding gun, a spring-loaded mechanism, a disposable ceramic cap that changed everything. One worker, 1 second per attachment point, no scaffolding, no workers trapped in compartments below. He'd shown his design to the supervisors. He'd explained how it would work. He'd demonstrated the principles, and they'd looked at him like he was insane. Impractical, they'd said. Not how we do things here. Stick to your welding, Nelson. So he did. He went back to his welding torch. He watched another submarine fall behind schedule. He saw 3 more men get hurt when scaffolding collapsed. And he made a decision. Ted Nelson had seen enough. He had the answer. Now he just needed someone to listen, even if it meant risking everything he had. Ted Nelson had been carrying his notebook for weeks, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone to ask the question he needed them to ask. It finally came during a production meeting. A Navy supervisor was complaining, again, about the submarine schedule. They were 3 weeks behind. The deck installations were taking too long. Something had to change. Nelson raised his hand. I have a solution. The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at the welder in the back corner. The supervisor nodded. Nelson opened his notebook and began to explain. Instead of bolting from both sides, above and below, they could weld threaded studs directly to the steel framework. From one side only, from above. A handheld gun would press the stud against the steel. An electrical arc would fuse them together in less than 1 second. The wooden planks would attach to these studs with specialized nuts. No scaffolding required. No workers below deck. No coordination between crews. No injuries. 1 worker. 1 gun. 1 second per stud. But here's the breakthrough, Nelson continued, his voice gaining confidence. The problem with stud welding has always been flux powder. It only works on horizontal surfaces because gravity holds the flux in place. Try to weld vertically or overhead and the flux just falls off. He flipped to his sketches. So we don't use loose powder. We encase the flux in a small ceramic cap, attach it to the end of each stud. The flux stays in place regardless of position. Vertical, horizontal, overhead, any angle you need. The supervisors stared at his drawings. One of them shook his head. Impractical. Not how we do things here, another added. This would cut installation time by 95%. Nelson interrupted. Stick to your welding, Nelson. The meeting moved on. His notebook closed. His solution was dismissed. But Ted Nelson didn't get angry. He got calculating. He went home that night and did something dangerous. He told his wife the truth. I'm thinking about quitting. She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. It was 1941. The Depression wasn't that far in the rearview mirror. They had 2 kids, a mortgage, medical bills from when their youngest had pneumonia. And Ted wanted to quit his secure government job to build a welding gun nobody believed would work. How long have you been thinking about this? She asked. 3 months. And you really think it'll work? I know it'll work. She was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. Then prove it. March 23rd, 1941. Ted Nelson walked into his supervisor's office and quit. No 2 weeks' notice. No explanation beyond I'm pursuing other opportunities. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was done waiting for the Navy to see what he saw. He was going to build it himself. Nelson found a partner almost immediately. Bill Hess, a fellow welder who'd overheard the production meeting disaster. Hess had money saved. Nelson had the design. They shook hands and got to work. In a rented garage workshop in Vallejo, they built the first prototype. A handheld welding gun, spring-loaded mechanism, electrical trigger, and the key innovation, ceramic flux caps that could be attached to threaded studs. The first test was a disaster. The spring tension was wrong. The stud welded at an angle. The second test wasn't much better. The ceramic cap shattered on impact. The third test, the fourth, the fifth. Nelson's savings dwindled. Hess started looking worried. The garage filled with failed prototypes and broken studs. Then December 7th, 1941 arrived. Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. Mare Island Naval Shipyard went into overdrive. The submarine production schedule that was already aggressive became absolutely frantic. America needed ships in the water, now. And somewhere in a Vallejo garage, two ex-welders were perfecting the exact solution the Navy desperately needed but had already rejected. The irony wasn't lost on Nelson. While Mare Island workers were still building scaffolding, still threading nuts by hand, still falling behind schedule, he was seconds away from proving all of them wrong. The breakthrough came in February 1942, test number 47. Nelson positioned a stud with its ceramic flux cap against a vertical steel plate, pulled the trigger. The electrical arc flashed. The ceramic cap disintegrated exactly as designed, releasing the flux at the perfect moment. The stud fused to the steel in 0.6 seconds, perfectly straight, perfectly strong, and perfectly positioned. Nelson pulled on the stud with both hands. It didn't budge. Bill Hess started laughing. They'd done it. Nelson didn't bother going back to the Navy. He went to their competitors. He called the Electric Boat Company in Connecticut, the Navy's primary submarine contractor. He explained what he'd built. They were skeptical, but agreed to a demonstration. Nelson arrived with his welding gun, a box of ceramic-capped studs, and a steel test plate. The electric boat engineers watched as he positioned the gun, pulled the trigger. Flash, 0.6 seconds. Done. He welded another stud and another, 10 studs in 6 seconds. The engineers looked at each other. Do that again. Nelson smiled and pulled the trigger. By the end of the day, Electric Boat had placed an order for 20 welding guns and 10,000 ceramic flux caps. Word spread through the defense industry like wildfire. Bethlehem Steel called. Newport News Shipbuilding called. Kaiser Shipyards called. Within 3 months, Nelson and Hess Manufacturing had contracts with every major shipbuilder on the West Coast, including Mare Island Naval Shipyard. The same supervisors who dismissed Nelson's idea as impractical were now buying his guns because every other shipyard was leaving them in the dust. Ted Nelson didn't gloat. He just shipped the equipment and sent the invoice. The Navy that rejected him now desperately needed him, and the real numbers were just starting to come in. Start with one stud, 0.6 seconds to weld. Compare that to the old method: drilling, positioning, scaffolding, threading, tightening. Hours of labor compressed into less than one heartbeat. Now multiply that single stud across one submarine deck. What used to take 12 men 7 days now took 2 men 8 hours. A 95% reduction in time, a 93% reduction in labor. But we're just getting started. Mare Island was building submarines. Newport News was building destroyers. Kaiser Shipyards was building aircraft carriers and Liberty ships. Bethlehem Steel was building everything. Every single one adopted Nelson's stud welding system. By the end of 1942, Nelson and Hess Manufacturing had delivered over 1,500 welding guns to defense contractors. By 1943, that number had tripled. The ceramic flux caps were being manufactured by the millions. The US Navy calculated the total impact in 1945 after the war ended. 50 million man-hours saved. Let that number sink in for a moment. 50 million hours. If one person worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no sleep, no rest, they would need to work for 5,700 years to equal that time. That person would have needed to start in 3741 BC, before the pyramids were built, before writing was invented, before the wheel. That's how much time Ted Nelson's impractical idea saved. But the impact went far beyond construction efficiency. Submarines reached the Pacific Theater months earlier than projected. Destroyers joined convoy escorts ahead of schedule. Aircraft carriers launched planes over Japanese positions sooner than anyone thought possible. Consider the USS Wahoo, a submarine built at Mare Island in 1942 using Nelson's stud welding system. The Wahoo completed construction 6 weeks ahead of the original timeline. It reached Pearl Harbor in time to participate in 7 war patrols, sinking 20 enemy ships and disrupting Japanese supply lines throughout the Pacific. 6 weeks earlier in the water, 7 additional patrols, 20 enemy ships that never delivered their cargo. Now multiply that across every vessel that benefited from faster construction. How many supply convoys were disrupted sooner? How many troops were transported safely because escort destroyers arrived ahead of schedule? How many airstrikes were launched from carriers that reached the Pacific months earlier than expected? The numbers become impossible to calculate, but the conclusion is undeniable. Ted Nelson's welding gun didn't just save time, it accelerated American naval superiority at the exact moment when every week mattered. And the technology spread beyond ships. Army tanks used stud welding for armor attachment. Aircraft manufacturers used it for structural components. Military infrastructure, bases, bridges, fuel depots, all built faster using Nelson's system. The man who was told to stick to his welding had fundamentally changed how America built the tools of war. In 1943, Nelson and Hess Manufacturing received the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Wartime Production. In 1944, they received it again. The company that started in a rented garage now employed over 200 workers and operated factories in 3 states. Ted Nelson became a millionaire from the idea the Navy rejected. But here's what's remarkable about Nelson. He never forgot where he came from. He never put on airs. He never claimed to be anything more than a welder who saw a problem and fixed it. When reporters asked him about his success, he would shrug and say, "I just made a better mousetrap." The world beat a path to my door. The Navy, the same bureaucracy that dismissed his idea as impractical, eventually adopted stud welding as the standard method for deck installation across every vessel class. The procedures manual was rewritten. The specifications were updated. They never apologized for rejecting him. They just quietly changed everything to match what he'd been telling them all along. Today, stud welding is everywhere. Modern ships, bridges, skyscrapers, vehicles. Anywhere metal needs to be joined quickly and permanently, you'll find Nelson's innovation at work. The global stud welding industry generates over $2 billion annually. Engineers and welders around the world use the same basic principle Nelson sketched in his notebook in 1941. Mare Island Naval Shipyard closed in 1996 after 142 years of service. The base built 512 ships over its lifetime, including 44 submarines. Parts of the old shipyard are now historical landmarks. Tourists walk through the preserved buildings and dry docks, imagining the frantic wartime production. But there's no monument to Ted Nelson, no museum exhibit explaining how a dismissed welder saved 50 million hours and changed naval construction forever. His story is largely forgotten except among welding professionals and maritime historians. And somehow, that feels appropriate, Because Ted Nelson never wanted monuments. He wanted solutions. He saw a problem. He fixed it. He saved his country 5,700 years of wasted labor. And then he got back to work. Ted Nelson's story isn't unique. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. December 1903, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, achieved powered flight at Kitty Hawk. Wilbur and Orville Wright had spent years being told by credentialed engineers and scientists that heavier-than-air flight was impossible. The Smithsonian Institution itself had declared it a waste of time. The Wright brothers didn't argue. They just built the plane and flew it. 1908, Henry Ford announced he would mass-produce automobiles affordable for average Americans. Industry experts laughed. The president of Michigan Savings Bank told Ford's lawyer, "The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty." Ford didn't debate them. He just built the assembly line and changed the world. 1938. Chester Carlson invented xerography, the photocopying process. He spent 7 years trying to sell the idea to IBM, Kodak, and over 20 other companies. Every single one rejected it as impractical and unmarketable. Carlson didn't give up. He finally found one small company willing to take a chance. That company became Xerox. Notice the pattern? Innovation doesn't come from the people with the most credentials. It comes from the people closest to the problem. The bicycle mechanics understand flight mechanics. The factory owner understands production. The patent clerk understands document copying. And the welder understands welding. The people doing the work see the inefficiencies most clearly. They feel the wasted motion. They know what's stupid about the current system because they're the ones suffering through it every single day. But here's the other part of the pattern. The institutions almost always reject them first. Why? Because institutions don't reward problem solving. They reward procedure following. They don't ask, does this work better? They ask, is this how we've always done it? Ted Nelson's Navy supervisors weren't stupid. They were bureaucrats. And bureaucracies survive by maintaining consistency, not by embracing change. Think about what rejection cost the Navy. If they'd listened to Nelson in March 1941, they could have implemented stud welding across all shipyards before Pearl Harbor. They could have had dozens of additional submarines in the Pacific by mid-1942. They could have saved those 50 million hours from the very beginning. Instead, they spent 2 years watching their competitors adopt Nelson's system while they fell further behind. They eventually bought the exact same equipment they'd rejected, except now they were paying premium prices to a private company instead of developing it in-house. Bureaucratic rejection doesn't just delay innovation. It often makes it more expensive and hands competitive advantage to whoever is willing to listen. But wars aren't won by consistency. Wars are won by adaptation. And adaptation requires listening to the Ted Nelsons of the world, even when, especially when, they're telling you that everything you're doing is wrong. This pattern hasn't stopped. It's happening right now. Somewhere today, a nurse has figured out a better way to prevent hospital infections. But hospital administration is telling her to follow the established protocol. Somewhere today, a warehouse worker knows exactly how to redesign the logistics flow to cut delivery times in half. But corporate management is telling him he doesn't understand the big picture. Somewhere today, a teacher has developed a method that actually helps struggling students learn. But the school district is telling her to stick to the approved curriculum. Somewhere today, a software engineer has figured out how to eliminate a security vulnerability that's costing her company millions. But the senior developers are telling her the legacy code can't be touched. Somewhere today, a mechanic knows why the fleet vehicles keep breaking down and exactly how to fix the root cause. But the procurement department is locked into a contract with the current parts supplier. These people are today's Ted Nelsons. They see the problem clearly, they've developed solutions, and they're being dismissed by people who've never done their jobs. Here's what history teaches us. We need to listen. Not because every idea will work, most won't, but because the occasional idea that does work can save 50 million hours, can win wars, can change industries, can save lives. If you're in a position of authority, if you're the supervisor, the manager, the administrator, your job isn't to protect procedures. Your job is to find the Ted Nelsons on your team and get out of their way. And if you're the Ted Nelson, if you've identified a problem and you know how to fix it, don't wait for permission. Document your solution. Build your prototype. Prove it works. Then let the results do the convincing. March 1941. Mare Island Naval Shipyard. A welding torch flickers in the submarine construction bay. Ted Nelson looks up at the scaffolding maze, at the workers risking injury for an inefficient process, at the submarines falling behind schedule while war approaches. And he makes a choice. One welder, one simple idea, one massive impact. He didn't have a PhD. He didn't have management approval. He didn't have institutional support. He just had a problem he understood and a solution that worked. 50 million hours saved. 5,700 years recovered. Submarines in the water sooner. Lives preserved because naval power arrived faster. All because one man refused to accept that "this is how we've always done it" was a good enough answer. History isn't made by people who follow procedures. History is made by people who see a problem and fix it, even when everyone says it can't be done. Ted Nelson saved 50 million hours with a tool everyone called impractical. With a design the Navy rejected. With an idea his supervisors dismissed. He did it anyway. So here's the question. What problem do you see clearly that everyone else is ignoring? What solution have you sketched in your notebook that people are telling you won't work? What impractical idea are you sitting on right now? Because somewhere out there, the next Ted Nelson is reading this, and they're deciding whether to follow procedures or to change history. Don't wait for permission. Build the solution.